So where do you start? How do you start engaging? How do you start connecting the end users and the middle layer folks and the senior leaders? It's not a trivial task. It's actually pretty hard. And they don't do it themselves. So how are you supposed to do it for them? It can be challenging. And then frankly, there's a lot of ways to do it poorly. And a lot of folks do, and it doesn't turn out very well for anybody. So let's talk about this. You are the technology developer. You find yourself an end user. We already talked about this. You can go to prototyping events, exercises, innovation events, what have you. There is an entire innovation ecosystem and a plethora of websites that are begging for you to engage with them. Okay? They may not carry money, but at the very least, a lot of them carry the promise of connections. So take them up on it and find an end user. Typically, the first stage looks a little bit like this. Hey, you're a technology developer and you're asking that end user what they need. If you already know what they need, great, you might have a good idea, but at the very least, you need to start by asking, right? Hey, I think you need counter drone technology. What do you actually need? Tell me about your life, right? Tell me about your pain points. This is like, ideal customer persona 101. Identify what your customer needs are, because otherwise, what are you solving? And oftentimes, they ask you what you have, right? I've been in so many of these conversations where we bring in operational end users, we sit down, they sit down, and we say, okay, what do you need? What are your problems? What are your gaps? They turn around and go, I don't know, what do you got? What's your thing? What does it do, right? And frankly, it often helps for you to start first, right? And it helps that you have maybe one technology that you already have in hand, or maybe you're thinking about a new technology. Either way, they don't know the quote realm of the possible necessarily, right? They have also a plethora of problems. They have a ton of issues, right? You can solve everything from their feet hurt in their current boots to their radar scopes don't work so good, right? So which problem are you trying to solve? Okay. Oftentimes it starts like this though, right? What do you have? What do you need? What do you have? What do you need? At some point, you're going to kind of winnow down to, I've got this new cool thing, right? This is your new cool thing, right? And oftentimes, if they're an end user, they kind of like it, right? It's awesome. It's new. It's different. If it wasn't new and different, then you wouldn't be making it because there wouldn't be a market like opportunity for it. And so you show it to them and you feel awesome about that. It's fantastic for people to validate your hypothesis that this new cool thing that you're building is actually valuable and is going to solve an operational need, right? It's great. And you get their feedback, just like I told you, right? Dev, ops. Ops people tell you what it is they need, and it's fantastic. You get to turn that around and feed it in and like develop on it, right? That DevOps cycle is fantastic. They give you that feedback, you improve your product. Then oftentimes, if you can, you want to demonstrate it to them. Like, oh, look, I tailored to you. It's ideal for your use case. It's fantastic, right? It's going to solve your problem. And they oftentimes want it, right? If you've got a better mousetrap that solves their problem, they're going to want it, right? Problem is that end users don't buy stuff, right? They don't. End users don't have money necessarily. That's the middle people problem. So if you try to figure out how to sell the technology through the end user, you're often going to get a head scratch, right? They might have a fuzzy idea of how that can work, but generally speaking, operational end users, regardless of how high up they are, have no idea how the actual acquisition process works, okay? But oftentimes they'll help you, okay? That's where the staff comes in. Those poor operational end users got to climb up the chain and find the folks who actually provide the capabilities to them. And they say, hey, I've got this need. I found this thing, right? And there's particularly a lot of this going on now because there's a lot of, end user engagement opportunities, a lot of, get technology in the hands of end user efforts. And so that end user might bring this new cool toy that you have to that middle layer, say, look, I found this new cool toy. Isn't it awesome? It solves my problem. Please, let's buy it. But that's not how that works, right? In order to buy things in a real way, you need an actual requirement, right? That's an actual thing, right? Let's not talk about capability development documents, capability production documents, all those sort of joint capability integration process things. But it has to be articulated in some way. You can't just say, hey, I want something, and they're going to give it to you, right? This is not Christmas. There's a process involved. And end users typically don't know that process, right? Maybe you can help them get to it, right? Maybe they can actually turn around and write a requirement. That's great, right? They'll sit down and write the necessary paperwork to get what they want and what they need. And then naturally, those middle layer folks have to deal with that requirement, okay? And the way this works, right, is the federal budget, particularly the DoD budget, it works on like multiple years, right? If you're spending money today, that money was created, it was thought about, it was quote unquote programmed like 3 years ago, if not more. So if you came up with a new cool thing today, chances are that the new cool money for it is not going to come for another 3 years from now. Well, that operational end user doesn't want something 3 years from now. They want something today, because in 3 years, they're not going to be the operational end user for you anymore. They'll have gotten promoted, they'll have moved, they'll have a different job. It won't be relevant to them. They want the new thing now. And so you go back and forth. Ideally, I hope to God you've figured out your pricing model. There are ways that the government buys stuff, right? There's different contract mechanisms, right? There's different ways of pricing things. Please, for the love of God, figure out how you're going to price stuff. The government tends to buy different things different ways, right? Software licenses and seats are bought differently than like hard end items versus pens, right? The way we buy an F-35 Joint Strike Fighter is wildly different than the way that we buy boots, right? They're very different things. So figure out your pricing model, and ideally orient your pricing model towards the real customer, right? That middle person, that staff person, that acquisition professional who's actually going to have to buy it, not necessarily the end user. The end user doesn't get a buying decision necessarily. And so you give them your price. It may or may not work. Like I said, in the current quote year of execution, right? The current year, there's usually not a whole lot of money, right? That money's all called for. It's all, accounted for. Maybe there could be some shakeout money towards the end of the year, but generally speaking, the way that budgets work and the way that budget programming works, you're not allowed to just have cash lying around. It all kind of has to be accounted for. Otherwise, they wouldn't have given it to you. And so you're typically going to kind of tick off that middle layer person, right? You've got that operational end user. They have this demand signal. They want this thing. If they're going to buy your thing, they have to not buy another thing. That's kind of how budgets work in the government. And so coming to that middle layer person, that staff person, that orange bubble person with a funding need in a year of execution is usually not welcomed. It's not treated well. And so oftentimes you'll get a no, particularly right now. You might get a yes 2 or 3 years from now if you do all the paperwork, but the right now is typically not going to happen. And so what I've seen a lot of folks do is they go, okay, I got you. I know what I'll do. I'm going to go up to the senior leader. And I'm going to show the senior leader my new cool thing. Because I followed John's instructions and I talked to the senior leaders and I aligned my new capability with their mission and vision, right? And their objectives for their command tour. And so I go show it to them and they love it, right? Because again, the incentive structure for that senior leader is to support things that support their vision and their objectives. So if your thing supports their objectives, then of course they're going to like it. And oftentimes, well-meaning but foolhardy technology developers use that as a cudgel against that middle layer staff person. And they try to leverage that senior leader to force the hand of that staff person to execute that budget that they want for their new thing. I'm telling you right now, you try that, you're going to have a bad time because you're going to screw up that budget. You're going to kind of tick off that middle layer person, and that senior leader is going to rotate in like 18 to 24 months. And that middle layer staff person is still going to be there. And so who's going to have the last laugh? The senior leader who moves off to their next assignment or retires, or that middle layer person who kind of had to bite the bullet in the current year, but in the next year has something to say about it? So this is not the best way to do it, right? This sequence diagram is a cautionary tale of what you should not do in integrating those three layers of dev, sec, bureaucracy, ops.